So for many of us, and indeed for the world at large, the goal of a path, of any kind of spiritual path or path of life, is something like human greatness or human wisdom. But what would those have meant to the Buddha in his days? So we'll look at a dialogue that the Buddha had with another Brahmin of his day to try to elucidate some of the differences between different views of what human greatness might be or what wisdom might be. Coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm the study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and less stress-filled life, consider subscribing. So we're going to look at an early text, a really interesting early text, where the Brahmin Vasakkara, who is a minister of state for the Magadha kingdom, in other words, a sort of a high-ranking official within the government, comes to talk to the Buddha. And he wants to have a dialogue with the Buddha about presumably what's been on his mind, which is his question about what makes someone great, what makes a great person. Because, well, we can probably presume that he thought himself pretty great or wanted to make himself greater. And so he came to the Buddha and wanted to have a dialogue about that. And Vasakkara had 4 different characteristics or properties that he looked for in somebody to tell whether they were great. And so he tells these to the Buddha. He says, these are the 4 things I think that a person needs to have in order to be a great person, a wise person. And I think many of these, or these all, can be interpreted in various ways. So I'll try to give you 2 interpretations I can see with what Vasakkara is saying. The first thing he says is that somebody who is truly great or truly wise has to have a broad range of knowledge in different fields. And this can be understood, I think, from a worldly perspective, meaning they have to know a lot about the world. They have to know, for example, maybe being a statesman, being somebody who is a minister of state. That's an ability, a skill that requires a lot of knowledge. They perhaps have to know a lot about different kinds of skills, let's say farming or metalwork. And these would, of course, allow the minister to do his job better, because if he doesn't know how to farm, then he's going to have difficulty knowing how to rule over farmers. So knowing the specifics of lots of different fields, he believes, is critical to the good life, or to the life of greatness, let's say. And now there's another interpretation of that, which lots of different knowledge in different fields might mean knowledge, for example, of the Vedas, of the different kinds of Vedic texts, or revealed kinds of texts, because he's a Brahmin, he comes from a Brahminic past, and the Brahminic religion or belief system is based upon these revealed texts, pre-Buddhist, several thousand years before the Buddha, revealed to certain kinds of seers, and the knowledge of the Vedas was extensive, so he might also be implying that you had to have that kind of background knowledge. Secondly, Vasakkara says that you have to have the ability to interpret various statements, so to know what certain claims mean, what certain sentences mean. And again, we can interpret that in 2 ways, at least 2 ways. First of all, in a sort of a worldly sense, again, knowing different fields, knowing different lifestyles, knowing different backgrounds, will allow us to interpret statements that we might otherwise find meaningless. So if a farmer is talking about a certain kind of grain or a certain kind of implement or tool, we wouldn't understand that if we didn't have knowledge or experience with that kind of farming. Perhaps it also means a knowledge of other languages, knowledge of other kinds of dialects. Again, worldly knowledge that will allow us to interact with other people who otherwise we wouldn't be able to. And certainly that can be extremely useful to us if we want the kind of greatness that Vasakkara is after, this kind of worldly greatness. Now, it also may mean that the great person or the wise person can interpret the Vedic texts, which we've discussed just now. Lots of the Vedic texts are cryptic, very cryptic. They're written in a very elusive kind of language. They don't. the meaning of them doesn't jump off the page at you. You have to interpret them. And so knowing how to correctly interpret the Vedas is part of the Brahmin's job, as it were, because the Brahmin was, above all, a religious leader, somebody who did the right sacrifices, who did the right kind of rites and rituals at the right time, by reading the Vedas and understanding them. Being able to interpret is also, from his point of view, probably a matter of interpreting the revealed texts. And the third of these four is having a good knowledge of history. Once again, we can understand that in two ways. We can understand that in a worldly sense, that somebody who wants to be great and wise in Vasakkara's way has to understand or has to know the history of the language or the land that he inhabits. He has to know what came before. He has to know who all these people are who are around him, and knowing their history will allow him. I'm using the word him because virtually everybody in that position in ancient India who was doing those kinds of things was a man. I don't even know that there were any women at that level. It was a very male-centric society. In any event, it'll allow him to do his job better because he's going to know who is who, and he's going to know the histories of these lands and these peoples. Also, from a religious perspective, knowing the history of the Vedas is extremely important as well to interpreting them and to understanding them correctly, and to know perhaps the history of the interpretations of the Vedas, the correct ones, perhaps the incorrect ones, where they came from. These are all things that enable a Brahmin to do his job or to do the kinds of things he has to do to be a Brahmin correctly. And fourth, the person has to be skillful and diligent in his household duties. And here actually it would be more than just his, it would be his or her, because household duties, of course, involve both men and women. Women really were, in ancient India, pretty much confined to a household kind of atmosphere, but both had to perform their duties skillfully and diligently in order to have a well-functioning family. And a lot of the notion of the Dharma, particularly in early Brahminic religion, it passed forward into Hinduism, the Dharma is largely understood within a sort of a lay or householder context. Everybody had their own Dharma, their own way of practicing. And that way was, first and foremost, a householder way, a way of running your household properly. Treat their family correctly, raise their children correctly, because they were supposed to have children. That is, for Vasakkara, critical to the great life, critical to wisdom, was this ability to run the family well. So now looking at all of these together, Vasakkara was clearly he was a powerful minister of state. And so what he was after when he was asking about the great life or the wise life is a life of knowledge, of worldly knowledge and of particular religious knowledge, of knowledge that gave you power. And so basically, wisdom is the kind of knowledge that gives you this kind of power and control. It's knowledge of history, it's knowledge of interpretation, it's knowledge of different kinds of fields of endeavor. It's also household ability, an ability to keep a household running properly, which we could extend to the state in general, of keeping a state running properly. I'm sure that's part of what he was thinking of. And we can expect he would have thought of them in sort of vaguely ethical terms, but maybe not. Maybe that was sort of outside of his scope. But on those very grounds, let's turn to the Buddha. And the Buddha doesn't touch the Brahmin statement. He either doesn't agree with it, he doesn't disagree with it. He simply passes it over and substitutes or suggests his own four. And those four are: the first one is that somebody who is truly great and truly wise works for the benefit of the many. And in particular, he works for the benefit of the many by teaching ethical living, by teaching Dharma, which in his understanding was living correctly, living ethically. The second thing that the Buddha recommends for the truly great person or the truly wise person is what we might call mental mastery. That such a person thinks what they want to think, when they want to think it, and intends what they want to intend, when they want to intend it. So they're not spending time thinking things that they really know are not right for them, and they're not spending time let's say in the Western terms, we might call on what we might call weakness of the will. In early Greek philosophy, weakness of the will is a big deal. It's the kind of thing that we're trying to get away from, because we have a will to do good, let's say, but we often fall short of that perfection, and we end up willing things that we know are not good for us, that we know are not right for us. And in early Buddhism, there isn't in general the same idea of weakness of the will. It's really not understood in those terms. It's understood that it's not so much that we have a will and we go against it, it's rather that we just end up intending things that just aren't right for us. And so when the Buddha says we intend what we intend, what we want to intend, that is an understanding of doing the right thing, that our mind is under our control in the sense of mental mastery over ethical thoughts and ethical behaviors. The third thing that the Buddha says is important for the great life or the wise life is quite interesting and different. It's not one we necessarily would think of, but he says it's important that the person be able to attain the jhanas, the absorption meditations, whenever they want to, and so that they're able to achieve a kind of pleasant abiding in this very life. If we'll recall, the jhanas, I did a lecture a video a while ago on right concentration. I'll try to remember to put a link up here. The jhanas are 4 or 8, depending on how we understand them, of mental absorptions. In other words, we have to do long meditation, the mind eventually gets absorbed, and a kind of a joy arises or bubbles up from the mind, from nowhere. It just happens automatically. It happens regularly. And you can train yourself to have this happen. And you can get into finer and finer states of mental pleasure by following a kind of a progression. But the point is that the Buddha said that practicing this kind of jhana or these kinds of meditations was extremely important, because these were, in his understanding, blameless kinds of pleasure. They were kinds of pleasure that were really not problematic in the way that physical pleasures of experiences with the physical world were. And so he very highly recommended that we try to achieve jhana in order to wean ourselves away from physical pleasures. And the physical pleasures, of course, are generally gained by power, wealth, fame, those kinds of things, because those allow us to buy things, those allow us to go on fancy trips, those allow us to have large bank accounts, those allow us to force other people to do our bidding. And so if we want pleasures in the world, in general, we have to strive to achieve these things. Whereas if we want the mental pleasures of jhana, we only have to train our mind, and we can get into them at will. And in his telling, the pleasures of jhana are greater than the pleasures we can get from the senses. So that once we achieve the pleasures of jhana for ourselves, then the pleasures of the senses become less important, and we can sort of let them go. And it's easier to let them go, because we understand that we can gain better pleasures for ourselves at any time. So we needn't be so striving after these pleasures of the senses or pleasures of ownership and so on. And the fourth quality of the great person or the wise person for the Buddha won't surprise us. It's the final achievement through wisdom of the ending of greed, hatred, and ignorance about the noble truths. That is, of course, for the Buddha, that it constitutes awakening. That's what it is to be wise for the Buddha. And that is the kind of thing that towards which the Buddha directed us on the path. So in his telling, in order to be truly great and truly wise, you have to have, of course, that is at the top scale, you have to have achieved awakening. That is what it is. To be truly great and truly wise is to be awakened, if we're talking about it at the top scale. So earlier we saw that Vasakkara sort of stood for a worldly, mundane, or a religious kind of view of what greatness meant, what wisdom really was. It was a kind of a way to get power in the world. For the Buddha, however, it's quite different. We can understand his approach is more what we might call supramundane or ethical. His view is that the true greatness, that true wisdom comes through ethics, not through control and power. It comes through a certain kind of control. It comes through self-control, but not control of the world. So what the Buddha recommends really is self-mastery, self-control, is ethics. is personal purification, purification of our virtues. It's important to understand, though, or to remember, to keep in mind, that the Buddha did not reject Vasakkara's opinion. He didn't say that Vasakkara was wrong, and he might have, but he didn't. And he didn't, I think, for a reason. Because the Buddha's view and Vasakkara's are compatible if we understand Vasakkara's in a certain way. That is, there's nothing wrong with having knowledge about lots of different fields of inquiry. There's nothing wrong about being able to interpret phrases, sentences, things people say correctly. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with knowing the history of the lands that we inhabit, or knowing our own past, or whatever it might be. Those can be very, very important. And indeed, there's nothing wrong with living a good household life, with having a diligent and effective household life, so long as they're understood in line with the Buddha's own recommendations. In other words, so long as they're understood in a kind of an ethical way. Although both Vasakkara and the Buddha had interpretations of human greatness and human wisdom, we might say that the Buddha gets closer at what human greatness and human wisdom is, so long as we understand that that really, at its heart, means something more about ethics, something more supramundane than something simply about worldly power and control. So in this sense, true wisdom isn't about knowing facts, isn't about knowing how to do certain things. It's about knowing what's important and not important. It's about knowing right from wrong. It's about knowing stuff about ethics in your bones rather than in your sort of mind. It's not a matter of cognition. It's not really so much a cognitive thing. It's more of a lived enterprise of approaching the world in a certain way, of being able to determine the right way and the wrong way, and the skillful or the unskillful way to approach the various things that surround us. That is to say, wisdom is really an ethical skill more than a cognitive skill. Which is not to say that cognition is bad. It's not to say that cognition is wrong. Again, the Buddha's view and Vasakkara's are completely compatible. It's just so long as we understand Vasakkara's in a certain way. Knowledge is cumulative. Knowledge is the sort of thing we pack up and pile up over time as we know more and more about the world. So, for example, we know infinitely more practically than somebody who lived 10,000 years ago, or more than somebody who lived 500 years ago. Simply the advance of knowledge, the advance of the sciences, has come so far that we really understand the world much, much more deeply than anybody else who's ever lived. But wisdom is not cumulative in the same way. It's not we can't really pile up wisdom. We can't really pile up ethics. It's simply a way of looking at the world. And in that sense, somebody who lived 10,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago could be just as wise as anybody living today, even though they might not know very much about the physical world because they wouldn't know the sciences. Nevertheless, they might be just as wise as anybody living today. Now, of course, if they had the knowledge we have today, they could be more effective. There's no doubt about that. So again, not trying to say anything wrong about knowledge, simply that wisdom is different. So we have here a difference really in goals. We have a worldly minister of state who's looking for control and power of the world, and that's what he really wants. The Buddha, on the other hand, looking at internal control, at mental mastery, at ethical living, at truly wise living in the sense of ethical living. I guess the question for you is, how do you approach the path? How do you approach these kinds of questions in your own life? How do you see other people approaching them? Not that we should necessarily spend our time judging others, because that's not really useful, but at least to sort of contrast perhaps your own views with those of others, or to say that you agree with other people in certain ways. Because there are many people who practice Buddhist paths who are really very active in the world, perhaps even active in politics, and so have to consider ways to sort of run these two kinds of things together. So if you're interested in more about this, check out my Patreon page. I have stuff up every once in a while. Thanks so much for all of your kind comments and questions. Thanks so much for your attention. I know that you have many other things you could be doing rather than watching YouTube videos, perhaps many things that might be you might think are more useful to you, but I think these are probably more useful to you in the long run if you're willing to put the time into it. So again, thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. Be well.